At the Crestwood Country Club, where money flowed as freely as the champagne, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and entitlement. Laughter echoed across the polished marble floors of the grand ballroom, a sound as bright and brittle as the crystal glasses clinking together. Guests in tailored suits and silk dresses drifted between tables laden with flowers, their voices a low, confident hum. This was the rehearsal dinner for Madison Crane and Elliot Vance, a union of two powerful families, and the entire event was a performance of wealth. In a quiet corner, away from the glittering spectacle, an elderly black man named Henry Lewis moved with a quiet, practiced grace. He wore a simple gray maintenance jacket over a faded uniform shirt. In his hand, a soft cloth glided over a silver serving tray, erasing the smudges left by careless fingers. He worked methodically, his focus absolute, a silent observer in a world that was not his own. His presence was meant to be invisible, a part of the background machinery that made such perfect evenings possible. Madison Crane, the bride-to-be, stood near a full-length mirror, a vision in white silk. The final fitting for her wedding gown was taking place right there, a spectacle for her inner circle. She turned this way and that, her lips curled in a self-satisfied smile. It was in that moment, catching a reflection in the mirror, that her eyes landed on Henry. A frown creased her perfectly smooth forehead. She saw not a man, but an imperfection in her perfect scene. He was standing near the auxiliary table where some of her dress accessories were laid out, his posture straight and still as he waited for the catering manager's next instruction. She watched him for a moment, her gaze filled with disdain. Then she sneered, her voice loud enough to carry across the room. "Can someone get him away from my things?" she called out, not to Henry but to the air, as if he were an object. "And what is he wearing?" She pointed a manicured finger at him. "Is that supposed to be some kind of costume? That uniform is so outdated, it looks like cheap cosplay." A few of her friends, eager to please, tittered with laughter. The sound was sharp and cruel. The guests fell silent, their eyes darting between the proud, shallow bride and the quiet, elderly janitor. What none of them knew, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was the universe of experience hidden behind that calm, weathered face. Henry Lewis wasn't just a janitor. He was retired General Henry Lewis, a man who had commanded armies, a man decorated with the highest honors a nation could bestow. More than that, he was the man who had personally dragged Madison's own father, Captain Richard Crane, from a firefight in a dusty foreign land, saving his life at the risk of his own. He was a ghost from a past Madison had never bothered to learn, a living piece of her own history that she had just casually dismissed as trash. And by the time the sun set on her wedding day, the very fabric of her world would be torn apart and remade. The same bride who now mocked him with such casual cruelty would stand before him, her voice trembling with a regret so profound it would shake the foundations of her life. She would be begging him, the old janitor, to do her the singular honor of walking her down the aisle, while every jaw in that very same ballroom dropped in stunned, reverent silence. Before we find out what happens next, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story already gave you goosebumps, hit that like button, because this one's about to hit hard. The rehearsal dinner at the Crestwood Country Club was an orchestra of opulence. The grand ballroom, with its soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers, was bathed in a warm golden light. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their music a delicate undercurrent to the confident chatter of the guests. Tables were dressed in pristine white linens, adorned with towering floral arrangements of lilies and roses. Waitstaff moved with silent efficiency, refilling glasses of champagne that cost more per bottle than some people made in a week. Henry Lewis, in his simple gray maintenance uniform, felt like a man from another world. He stood near the service entrance, polishing a stack of silverware, his movements precise and unhurried. Each fork, each spoon was a small task to be completed with dignity. He found a strange peace in the work, a quiet purpose that insulated him from the spectacle around him. He had chosen to be here, to work in the background, to watch over the daughter of his fallen friend from a distance. He had not expected to be noticed. Madison Crane, however, noticed everything that was out of place in her meticulously crafted world. Her eyes, sharp and critical, scanned the room, ensuring every detail was perfect. When her gaze fell upon Henry, it was like finding a crack in a priceless vase. He was an anomaly, a disruption to the seamless flow of luxury. He was standing too close to a table displaying some of her bridal accessories, his posture too straight, his presence too solid. She wrinkled her nose, her voice, accustomed to being obeyed, cut through the gentle hum of conversation. Look at that," she said to her maid of honor, a woman as polished and superficial as herself. "Why is the help just standing around?" She didn't lower her voice. She wanted to be heard. She wanted him to feel the sting of her disapproval. Henry, who had heard far worse things shouted in the heat of battle, did not flinch. He simply continued his work, his expression unchanging. This infuriated Madison more than any argument could have. His silence felt like a defiance of her authority. She walked towards him, her silk dress whispering across the marble floor. "Excuse me," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. She stopped a few feet from him, looking him up and down as if he were an insect. She gestured toward the faded military pins on the collar of his shirt, visible just beneath his maintenance jacket. "What is all that old junk on your collar? Is that part of the uniform? It's tacky." The guests closest to them fell silent, their conversations tapering off as they turned to watch the unfolding drama. A few of them smirked, entertained by Madison's casual cruelty. Henry paused his polishing. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. They were calm, clear, and held a depth of experience that Madison could not begin to fathom. He saw a young woman who had been given everything and taught the value of nothing. "They're just old memories, ma'am," he said, his voice soft but steady. The simplicity of his answer, the lack of apology or defensiveness, only fueled her scorn. "Memories?" she scoffed, a brittle laugh escaping her lips. "This is a high-end country club, not a VFW hall. Your jacket is completely outdated. Honestly, you're an eyesore." She turned to the room, raising her voice for dramatic effect. "Can we please have a certain standard for the staff here?" She waved a dismissive hand in his direction, a queen shooing away a fly. "Go on, move along. You're making the place look cheap." The small pocket of guests who had been watching chuckled, their laughter a soft, cruel echo of Madison's own. Henry stood his ground for a moment longer, a silent pillar of dignity in a sea of arrogance. He saw the faces of the men he had served with, men who had given everything for the very freedoms these people took for granted. He felt a deep, abiding sadness, not for himself, but for her, for Richard's daughter. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, he turned and walked back toward the service corridor, his back straight, his head held high. His dignity remained perfectly intact, a shield they could not penetrate. From across the room, a young waitress named Emma Carter watched the entire exchange. Her tray of empty champagne flutes felt suddenly heavy in her hands. She had seen Henry around the club before. He was always quiet, always kind, always offering a gentle smile to the other staff members. She had seen him give half his lunch to one of the bus boys who was struggling to make ends meet. To see him treated with such blatant disrespect made something hot and angry coil in her stomach. Her expression shifted from discomfort to a quiet, simmering disbelief. She looked at Madison, who was now preening, basking in the attention her little display of power had garnered. Then she looked at Henry's retreating back, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this was not over. The world had a way of balancing its accounts, and Madison Crane had just made a very large, very foolish withdrawal from an account she didn't even know existed. Just as Henry reached the swinging door to the kitchen, Madison's fiancé, Elliot Vance, strode up to her, a wide, smug grin on his face. He wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. Elliot was a man whose confidence was built entirely on the foundation of his father's fortune. He saw the world as a hierarchy, and he was firmly, unassailably at the top. Well done, my love, he said, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. You can't have people like that just lingering. It lowers the tone. He glanced toward the door Henry had just disappeared through. He probably bought that uniform from a thrift store, Elliot joked, eliciting another round of sycophantic laughter from their friends. Trying to look like a big shot. It's pathetic. Madison beamed, leaning into him. I know, right? It's just embarrassing. She felt a surge of satisfaction. She had asserted her dominance, reminded everyone of her status. This was her world, and everyone in it had a role to play. His role was to be invisible. She turned, her eyes scanning the room until they found the club manager, a harried-looking man named Mr. Davison. She beckoned him over with an imperious flick of her wrist. Mr. Davison scurried to her side, his face a mask of anxious politeness. Is there a problem, Miss Crane? He asked, his voice betraying his nervousness. Madison didn't bother with pleasantries. Yes, there is, she said, her voice hard. You're janitor. I don't want old janitors hanging around my wedding. I'm paying a small fortune for this venue to be perfect, and that includes the staff. I want him gone, not just for tonight, for the entire wedding weekend. Mr. Davison's face paled. He knew Henry. Henry wasn't just a janitor, he was a volunteer who helped out, a respected figure among the staff. But Madison Crane's family were prominent members of the club, and their wedding was the biggest event of the year. He couldn't afford to anger them. He swallowed hard, the whispers of the nearby guests ringing in his ears. They were all watching, judging. Of course, Ms. Crane, he stammered. I apologize. I will handle it immediately. He turned and walked quickly toward the service corridor, his shoulders slumped. Madison watched him go, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She had won. She always won. Inside the corridor, Mr. Davison found Henry quietly wiping down a stainless steel counter. He looked up as the manager approached, his eyes calm and knowing. He had heard everything. Mr. Davison couldn't meet his gaze. He stared at a spot on the floor, his face flushed with shame. Henry, I'm so sorry, he began, his voice barely a whisper. Miss Crane, she insisted. She doesn't want... She asked that you step outside for a bit. Maybe take the rest of the evening off. Henry placed his cleaning cloth neatly on the counter. He showed no anger, no resentment. There was only a quiet acceptance, a profound understanding of the situation. It's all right, David, he said, his voice gentle. You have a job to do. He began to untie the apron of his maintenance jacket. I understand. He complied without a single word of protest, his silence a more powerful indictment than any angry outburst could ever be. It cut deeper, leaving those who witnessed it with a lingering sense of their own smallness. As Henry pushed open the back door and stepped into the cool night air, he heard light footsteps behind him. It was Emma, the young waitress. She held a glass of water in her hand, her face etched with concern and outrage. Mr. Lewis, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I saw what happened. I am so sorry. What she did, what they said, it was horrible. Henry turned to face her, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. He looked up at the vast, star-dusted sky, a stark contrast to the artificial brightness of the ballroom. He took a deep breath, the night air clean and fresh. He looked at this young woman, at her earnest, compassionate face, and he saw a flicker of hope. He appreciated her kindness more than she could know. Thank you, Emma, he said softly, but you don't need to apologize for them. He paused, his gaze becoming distant, as if he were looking back through time. People show you who they are when they think you're no one, he said, the words carrying the weight of 1,000 battles, 1,000 moments of judgment, both on the battlefield and off. Don't you ever forget that. Emma stood there, the glass of water forgotten in her hand, the simple truth of his words settling deep in her soul. She was watching a giant of a man, and the rest of the world was too blind to see it. The cool night air felt good on Henry's skin. It was a clean feeling, a welcome contrast to the stifling atmosphere of manufactured joy and casual cruelty inside the ballroom. As he leaned against the cool brick of the building, his mind drifted back, pulled by the currents of memory. The image of Madison Crane, with her dismissive wave and scornful laugh, faded away, replaced by a scene of dust, smoke, and the deafening roar of chaos. The memory was as sharp and clear as if it were yesterday. Afghanistan. The sun was a merciless hammer in a bleached white sky. Henry wasn't a janitor then. He was a general, his uniform crisp, his authority absolute. But on that day, in that ambush, ranks meant little. Survival was the only currency. His unit was pinned down, enemy fire raining down from the rocky ridges above. A young captain, a brave but green officer, had been hit. He was out in the open, a sitting duck, his leg shattered. That man was Captain Richard Crane, Madison's father. Henry could still hear the desperate cries for a medic, the crackle of the radio, the relentless chatter of machine gun fire. He had a choice: stay in cover and command the counterattack from a position of safety, or risk everything for one man. For General Henry Lewis, it was never a choice. He had given the order for covering fire, and then he had run. He ran through the hail of bullets, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He reached Richard, whose face was pale with shock and pain. "Hang on, son," Henry had said, his voice a calm anchor in the storm of violence. "We're going home." He had hoisted the younger man onto his shoulders, the weight of him a heavy, grounding presence. Every step back to the relative safety of their armored vehicle was a battle against fear, against exhaustion, against the odds. But he had made it. He had saved Richard Crane's life. They had forged a bond in that crucible of fire, a brotherhood that transcended rank and time. Years later, when Richard passed away from an illness stateside, Henry had felt the loss like a physical blow. He had made a silent promise at his friend's funeral, a vow whispered over the polished wood of the casket. "I'll look out for her, Richard, I promise." The flashback dissolved, and Henry found himself back in the present, standing in the quiet service corridor of the Crestwood Country Club. He had been drawn back inside by a need to see his friend's face one more time. He walked down a hallway lined with portraits of the club's most distinguished members, and there, near the end, was a framed photograph of Captain Richard Crane in his full-dress uniform, a handsome, smiling man in the prime of his life. It was part of a small memorial wall the club had erected for members who had served in the military. Henry reached out a hand, his fingers gently tracing the edge of the frame. He looked into the smiling eyes of his friend, a man he had loved like a brother. "I promised to look out for her, old friend," Henry whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But she's lost her way. She doesn't see the world the way you did." He felt a profound sense of failure. He hadn't just come here to watch over her. He had come here to fulfill another promise. But now, after the humiliation he had just endured, he knew he had to do more. He had to teach her a lesson her father never had the chance to. A lesson in humility, in respect, in the true measure of a person's worth. The full truth of Henry's presence at the country club was a secret known only to him and a handful of lawyers. He was not a staff janitor. He wasn't even a volunteer in the traditional sense. He was the event's primary anonymous benefactor. The Crane-Vance wedding was more than just a lavish party. It was also a high-profile charity event publicly supporting the Veterans Family Fund, a cause dear to the Crane family since Richard's passing. Madison had made it the centerpiece of her wedding publicity, boasting about her family's generosity in magazines and on social media. What she didn't know was that the single largest donation, a staggering $500,000, had come from an anonymous trust managed by one Henry Lewis. He had set it up years ago, using the fortune he had quietly built through shrewd investments after his military career, to honor the men and women he had served with. He had chosen to work at the wedding for two reasons. First, he wanted to ensure the money was being used properly. He had seen too many charities where funds were squandered on administrative costs and lavish galas rather than reaching the people who truly needed them. By being on the inside, a ghost in the machine, he could observe the operation firsthand without the fanfare and false reverence his real identity would attract. Second, and more importantly, he wanted to honor his promise to Richard in the quietest way possible. He wanted to be a guardian angel, a silent presence at his daughter's wedding, ensuring one of the foundations of her new life was built on a tribute to her father's legacy. He had never intended to reveal himself. He had expected to polish silverware, clear tables, and watch Madison begin her new life from the shadows, his heart filled with a bittersweet sense of closure. He never, in a million years, expected to be publicly humiliated by the very person he was there to honor. But now, everything had changed. The universe had presented him with an opportunity, a teachable moment of profound significance. This was no longer just about closure. It was about a lesson that Madison Crane and everyone in her orbit desperately needed to learn. Emma, her shift over, found herself unable to leave. The words Henry had spoken echoed in her mind. People show you who they are when they think you're no one. She felt a pull, a need to check on him, to make sure he was all right. She found him in the small Spartan staff break room at the back of the club, sitting alone at a small table, sipping a cup of black coffee. He had removed his gray maintenance jacket, and now she could clearly see the uniform shirt he wore beneath it, and the medals. Her breath caught in her throat. Pinned above the pocket were several rows of ribbons, a colorful tapestry of service and sacrifice. But it was the one at the very top, hanging from a distinct blue ribbon, that made her eyes widen in stunned recognition. She wasn't a military expert, but she had seen it before in documentaries and history books. The design was unmistakable. It was the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor. A chilling stillness fell over her. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. The quiet, humble janitor, the man who had been mocked and dismissed like a piece of trash, was a national hero. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, her fingers fumbling with the screen. She quickly typed his name, Henry Lewis, into the search bar, adding the words, Medal of Honor. The results flooded her screen in an instant. General Henry Lewis, a decorated four-star general, a hero of multiple conflicts, a respected military strategist, and a renowned philanthropist. There were pictures of him shaking hands with presidents, addressing troops, his uniform gleaming, his presence commanding. It was the same man, the same calm, steady eyes, the same quiet strength. She felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. The sheer scale of Madison's ignorance, of her arrogance, was staggering. She had mocked a living legend. Emma looked up from her phone, her heart pounding. She walked over to his table and sat down, her mind racing. "I know who you are," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "You're General Henry Lewis. I saw the medal. I Googled you." Henry looked at her, his expression unchanged. He simply took another slow sip of his coffee. "I'm just Henry," he said quietly. Emma's sense of injustice flared. "You have to tell them," she insisted, her voice rising with passion. "You have to go out there and tell Madison who you are. You can't let her get away with what she did." Henry set his cup down and looked at her, his gaze kind but firm. "And what would that accomplish, Emma?" he asked gently. "Would it make her a better person? Or would it just shame her in front of her friends? Humiliation is a poor teacher. True change comes from understanding, not from fear." Emma was floored by his response. He had every right to be angry, to want revenge, but all he showed was a deep, unwavering sense of purpose. "But it's not right," she argued, her voice pleading. "No need to prove anything," Henry said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who was completely sure of who he was. A person's character isn't defined by the medals on their chest. And the truth has a way of revealing itself, all in good time. Emma looked at the photos on her phone, at the evidence of his incredible life. She knew he was right. A public confrontation now would be messy and vindictive. But she also knew she couldn't let this go. She discreetly took a screenshot of the articles and photos. She would hold on to them. She wouldn't use them to humiliate Madison, but to help the truth reveal itself, just as Henry had said. She would help him, quietly, and wait for the right moment. Back in the grand ballroom, the party had reached its peak. The champagne flowed, the music swelled, and the laughter grew louder, more unrestrained. Madison Crane was the radiant center of it all, holding court with her bridesmaids. The incident with the janitor had, in her mind, only solidified her status. It was a story she was already refining, polishing for maximum dramatic effect. "You should have seen his face," she said, her voice filled with theatrical glee as she recounted the tale for the 5th time. "He just stood there, like he didn't know what hit him." Her bridesmaids, a chorus of young women who mirrored her own values, giggled and gasped at all the right moments. "Honestly," Madison continued, taking a delicate sip of champagne, "I think I did him a favor. These people should know their lane. This is our world, not theirs. He doesn't belong here." Her fiancé, Elliot, sidled up behind her, draping his arms around her shoulders. "That's my girl," he murmured into her ear, his voice a low purr of approval. "Always in control." He kissed her cheek, and she leaned into him, feeling powerful, desired, and utterly justified. "Someone has to maintain standards," she said with a dismissive shrug. "If I didn't say something, who knows what riffraff they'd let in here." They were so absorbed in their own self-congratulation that they didn't notice the wedding planner, a woman named Sarah, standing a few feet away. Sarah had overheard the entire conversation, and a knot of discomfort tightened in her stomach. She had seen the way Madison had treated the elderly man. It had been ugly and unnecessary. But the Cranes were a powerful family, and this wedding was the biggest contract of her career. To intervene, to say anything, would be professional suicide. So she remained silent, her complicity a bitter taste in her mouth. From the other side of the room, near the service station she was supposed to be clearing, Emma watched them. She saw Madison's smug smile, Elliot's arrogant posture, the thoughtless laughter of their friends. She saw Sarah, the planner, turn away, her face a mask of conflict, and Emma's jaw clenched. The screenshot on her phone felt like a loaded weapon. Henry's words about the truth revealing itself echoed in her mind. He was right to be patient. He was playing a longer game. A public shaming would be fleeting, but a lesson in true character, in real honor, could last a lifetime. Justice was coming. Emma could feel it. It wasn't going to be loud and explosive. It was going to be quiet, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. She filled her tray with empty glasses, her movements precise and controlled, a quiet fury fueling her resolve. She would play her part. She would wait for Henry's signal. And when the time came, she would be ready to help him reveal the truth. Later that night, long after the last of the guests had departed in their luxury cars, Henry Lewis stood on the manicured lawn of the country club. The party was over, but his work was not. The air was cool and still, and the sky was a deep velvet black, scattered with the cold, distant light of 1,000 stars. He pulled his old, worn cell phone from his pocket. It was a simple, functional device, not a flashy smartphone like the ones everyone inside had been glued to. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over a single entry. He pressed the call button and held the phone to his ear. It rang only once before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Sir?" The voice was alert, respectful, and accustomed to taking orders at any hour. Henry didn't waste time with pleasantries. His voice was calm, steady, and held the unmistakable weight of command. "This is General Lewis," he said simply. The title felt foreign on his tongue after so many years of quiet civilian life, but tonight it was necessary. It was a key, unlocking doors that had been closed to him just hours before. "I need a favor for tomorrow's event at the Crestwood Country Club." There was no hesitation on the other end of the line, no questions asked. The person on the phone, a high-ranking aide at the Pentagon who had served under Henry for years, knew that when the general called, it was a matter of national importance, even if it sounded personal. "Understood, sir," the aide replied, his voice a model of efficiency. "Consider it done. What do you need?" Henry laid out his plan, his instructions clear, concise, and strategically brilliant. It was a quiet call lasting no more than 3 minutes, but it set in motion a series of events that would change the course of the next day in ways no one could possibly predict. After he ended the call, Henry slipped the phone back into his pocket. He stood there for a long moment, his hands clasped behind his back, looking up at the vast, silent expanse of the night sky. He thought of Richard Crane, of his laughter, his courage, his unwavering belief in the good of people. He had tried to honor his friend quietly, to fulfill his promise from the shadows. But Madison's actions had made that impossible. Now he had to honor Richard in a different way. He had to give his daughter the one thing her father's money could never buy: a chance at redemption. "This is for you, Richard," Henry whispered to the stars, his voice a soft murmur in the quiet night. "For your daughter. May she finally learn what it means to be a Crane." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves in the trees around him, a soft, sighing sound that felt, for a moment, like an answer. His promise was still alive, and tomorrow it would be fulfilled. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, a perfect blue sky stretching over the perfectly manicured grounds of the Crestwood Country Club. The atmosphere was electric, a hive of activity buzzing with a nervous, excited energy. Flower arrangements were being positioned, sound systems were being checked, and a small army of staff rushed to and fro, making sure every detail was flawless. The guest list was a who's who of the city's elite, and the media had taken notice. A line of television news vans was parked discreetly near the service entrance, their satellite dishes pointed at the sky, ready to broadcast the wedding of the year to the waiting world. What no one in the buzzing crowd knew was that the story had changed overnight. Thanks to Henry's quiet phone call, the narrative had been subtly but powerfully rewritten. An official press release had been issued at dawn from the Department of Veterans Affairs. It announced that in honor of the late Captain Richard Crane's distinguished service, the department was now an official sponsor of the wedding's charitable efforts. The announcement lent an air of gravitas and national importance to the event, and it was the reason the media presence had suddenly doubled. Inside, Emma Carter moved with a newfound sense of purpose. She had received a simple one-line text from Henry that morning. "The truth arrives at noon. Make sure there is a seat for it in the front row." She understood immediately. She went about her duties, setting tables and arranging place cards, but her real work was being done in secret. She spoke to the head usher, a young man she was friendly with, and explained that a special guest of honor, a decorated veteran, would be arriving and needed a reserved seat in the front pew, right on the aisle. She then went to the wedding planner, Sarah, and casually mentioned that the representative from the Department of Veterans Affairs might want to say a few words. She planted the seeds, creating the space for Henry's plan to unfold. She ensured that when the moment came, Henry would not be in the back, hidden away. He would be front and center. Meanwhile, in the bridal suite, Madison Crane was a world away from these quiet machinations. She sat in a silk robe, surrounded by her bridesmaids, a makeup artist, and a hairstylist, a queen in her court. Her world was a whirlwind of hairspray, champagne, and the constant flash of her own phone's camera. She was documenting every moment, curating the perfect narrative for her thousands of social media followers. "The big day is finally here," she typed, adding a dozen heart emojis. She was completely oblivious to the tectonic shifts happening just outside her bubble of self-absorption. The news of the VA's sponsorship had reached her, of course, but she had interpreted it through her own lens of vanity. "Can you believe it?" she had squealed to her mother. "They're sponsoring my wedding. It's going to be amazing for our brand." The deeper meaning, the connection to her father's legacy of service, was completely lost on her. For Madison, it was just another accessory, another feather in her cap, another reason for the world to watch her. She had no idea that the curtain was about to be pulled back, and the show she thought she was starring in was about to become a very, very different kind of story. Just moments before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, as the last of the guests found their seats in the sun-dappled garden where the vows would be exchanged, a new set of arrivals caused a ripple of confusion to spread through the crowd. 3 black sedans with government license plates pulled up to the main entrance. From them emerged a small contingent of men and women in immaculate full-dress military uniforms. They were high-ranking officers, their chests adorned with an impressive array of ribbons and medals. They moved with a purpose and discipline that stood in stark contrast to the leisurely pace of the other wedding guests. They didn't mingle or make small talk. Instead, they formed a neat line near the entrance to the garden, their faces somber and respectful. They scanned the crowd, their eyes searching. Then, as one, they turned their gaze toward the back, and each of them raised a hand in a crisp, formal salute. Madison, who was peeking out from a window in the bridal suite, saw the officers arrive. "Oh, look," she said to her bridesmaids, a note of pleasant surprise in her voice. "The VA must have sent a color guard or something. That's fantastic. It's some extra PR for the charity. It will look amazing in the photos." She dismissed them as props, part of the scenery for her perfect day, and turned her attention back to her reflection in the mirror, making one final adjustment to her veil. She was completely unaware of who they were saluting. Down below, standing quietly near the back of the garden, just by the aisle, was Henry Lewis. He was no longer in his janitor's grays. He was now wearing his own dress blues, the same uniform he had worn when meeting with presidents and commanding armies. The deep blue fabric was perfectly pressed, and across his chest the rows of ribbons and medals glittered in the sunlight. The Medal of Honor was there, right at the top, a silent testament to his extraordinary courage. Emma, standing near the service tent, saw it all unfold. She saw the officers arrive. She saw them salute. And she saw Henry, standing tall and resolute, give them a subtle, almost imperceptible nod in return. A powerful wave of emotion washed over her. It was happening. The quiet truth was about to step into the light. She exchanged a quick, knowing glance with Henry from across the lawn. His eyes were calm, but she could see a flicker of something else in them. Not triumph, but a deep, solemn sense of duty. He was not here to gloat. He was here to keep a promise. He was here to right a wrong. The string quartet began to play the gentle opening notes of the bridal march. The guests fell silent, their faces turning toward the back of the aisle in anticipation. The ceremony was beginning, and the carefully constructed world of Madison Crane was about to come crashing down. The music swelled, and the ceremony began. The bridesmaids walked down the aisle one by one, their pastel dresses a soft counterpoint to the vibrant green of the garden. Then came the flower girl, scattering petals with innocent glee. A hush fell over the crowd. It was time for the bride. Madison appeared at the end of the aisle, a vision in white, her arm linked through the arm of her proud, beaming mother. As she began her slow, deliberate walk toward the altar where Elliot waited, a wave of gasps and whispers rippled through the guests. It wasn't her dress that had captured their attention. It was the man standing quietly on the edge of the aisle, the man in the decorated military uniform. It was the janitor. They recognized him instantly. The confusion was palpable. People craned their necks, murmuring to one another. What is he doing here? Why is he in that uniform? Madison and Elliot remained oblivious, lost in their own moment. They reached the altar, and the officiant, a kindly man with a warm smile, began the traditional opening words. "We are gathered here today to celebrate the union of Madison and Elliot," he said, his voice resonating through the garden. He spoke of love, of commitment, of the joining of two families. Then he reached the pivotal moment. "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" he asked, turning to Madison's mother. But before her mother could answer, a clear, authoritative voice cut through the air. It came from one of the uniformed officers standing in the front row. The officer, a stern-looking man with a chest full of medals, had risen to his feet. He turned and faced not the officiant, but Henry, who was still standing near the back. "General Lewis, sir," the officer called out, his voice sharp and full of respect. "This is your cue." The world seemed to grind to a halt. A collective, audible gasp swept through the crowd. Every head in the garden swiveled to stare at Henry. "General? General Lewis?" The name echoed in the sudden, ringing silence. Madison froze. The practiced smile on her face melted away, replaced by a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a pasty, chalky white. She turned slowly, mechanically, her eyes wide with disbelief, until they locked onto the man in the dress blues. The janitor. The man she had mocked, humiliated, and had thrown out of her rehearsal. He was standing there, his posture erect, his gaze steady, his uniform blazing with honors in the bright afternoon sun. It was him. It was undeniably, impossibly him. Elliot, standing beside her, stammered, his own arrogant composure shattering into a million pieces. That can't be," he whispered, his voice cracking. "That can't be the same man." But it was. And in that moment of stunning, earth-shattering revelation, the entire silent crowd knew it too. The illusion had been broken. The truth had arrived. The carefully constructed facade of Madison's life crumbled in an instant. The name, General Lewis, struck her with the force of a physical blow. But it was the uniform that broke her. Her mind, reeling with shock, latched onto the familiar details of the crisp blue fabric, the gleaming gold buttons, the specific arrangement of ribbons on his chest. And then a memory, buried deep beneath years of self-absorption, surged to the surface. It was a photograph that had sat on her father's desk for as long as she could remember. It was a picture of her dad in his own uniform, standing beside another man, his arms slung around the man's shoulders, in a gesture of easy camaraderie. They were both young, smiling, alive. The other man in the photo, the man her father had always called his guardian angel, was wearing the exact same uniform, the same insignia, the same decorations. He was a younger, unweathered version of the man standing before her now. Tears welled in Madison's eyes, hot and thick, blurring the world into a kaleidoscope of colors. Her entire demeanor, the pride, the arrogance, the carefully cultivated air of superiority, collapsed like a house of cards. A choked sob escaped her lips. "You," she whispered, her voice a raw, trembling thread of sound. You knew my dad?" The question hung in the still, silent air, a desperate plea for a truth she was not ready to hear. Henry took a slow step forward, his eyes filled not with triumph or anger, but with a deep, profound compassion. He saw not the arrogant bride who had mocked him, but the grieving daughter of his fallen friend. He gave a single, slow nod. "He was more than my soldier," Henry said, his voice calm and clear, yet carrying a weight of shared history that resonated through the garden. "He was my brother in arms." The words landed with devastating finality. The guests were speechless, their faces a mixture of shock, awe, and a dawning sense of shame for their own complicity, for their own silent judgment. From the side, Emma watched, tears streaming down her own face. They were tears of pride, of relief, of a deep emotional catharsis. The truth was more powerful than she could have ever imagined. The officiant, seeing Madison's complete breakdown, wisely paused the ceremony. The stunned silence was broken by a sudden, frantic eruption of activity. The reporters and cameramen at the back of the garden, who had been there to cover a simple high society wedding, suddenly realized they were in the middle of a much bigger story. Camera flashes began to strobe, their bright, intrusive lights adding a surreal quality to the scene. The truth, now unleashed, flooded the crowd like a tidal wave. Whispers turned into frantic murmurs as people pulled out their phones, their fingers flying across the screens. "It's him! General Henry Lewis! He's a Medal of Honor recipient!" The news spread through the assembled guests in seconds, each confirmation adding another layer of shock and disbelief. The story of what had happened at the rehearsal dinner the night before began to circulate, passed from person to person in hushed, horrified tones. The mockery, the humiliation, the demand to have him thrown out. It was all recontextualized in the blinding light of this new reality. The guests who had chuckled at Madison's cruel jokes now stared at the ground, their faces burning with shame. Elliot, utterly humiliated, tried to salvage the situation with a desperate, braying laugh. "Well, isn't this something?" he exclaimed, his voice high and unnatural. "Who knew our janitor was such a big deal?" He tried to play it off as a charming, unexpected surprise, but his panic was transparent. Henry turned his calm, steady gaze on him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Respect, son," he said, his words quiet but cutting like a surgeon's scalpel. "Doesn't wear a price tag. It's not something you can buy or inherit." Elliot shrank back, silenced, his pathetic attempt at bravado dissolving under the weight of Henry's quiet authority. Just then, the wedding planner, Sarah, rushed to the small podium. Her face was pale, but her voice was firm. She had been given her own set of instructions. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice amplified by the microphone, "there has been a change of plans. We are honored to announce that the true benefactor of this wedding's charitable fund and our guest of honor for the remainder of the day is General Henry Lewis." The announcement was met with a wave of stunned applause. It was the final devastating piece of the puzzle. He wasn't just a hero, he was their patron, the man whose generosity they were all there to celebrate, the man Madison had called an eyesore. The full weight of her actions crashed down on Madison. She wasn't just a fool. She was a hypocrite of the highest order. Sobbing uncontrollably, her perfect makeup running in black streaks down her face, she stumbled forward. She stopped in front of Henry, her body trembling with a shame so profound it was painful to watch. "I'm sorry," she cried, her voice breaking, the words torn from the very depths of her soul. "Oh, God, I am so sorry." She apologized, not just to him, but to everyone, to her guests, to her mother, and to the memory of the father she had so profoundly dishonored. In the midst of the flashing cameras and the stunned silence of the crowd, Madison stood before Henry, a broken woman. Her apology hung in the air, a raw and desperate plea for an absolution she did not deserve. Henry looked at her, at the tears carving paths through her expensive makeup, at the genuine soul-deep agony in her eyes. He saw the spoiled child she had been, but he also saw the shattered woman she had become. And in that moment he knew what Richard would have wanted. Forgiveness. Not for Madison's sake, but for the sake of the man he had been. He didn't offer words of comfort. He didn't say, "I forgive you," an act of grace that profound required more than words. Instead, in a gesture that stunned everyone into a new, deeper silence, he slowly, deliberately extended his arm. Madison looked at his outstretched arm, her tear-filled eyes wide with confusion. She didn't understand. Then she did. It was the gesture of a father, an escort, a guardian. It was an offer to rescue her from the ruins of her own making. With a trembling hand, she took his arm. The entire crowd, from the high society guests to the catering staff, rose to their feet as one. A soft, reverent applause started at the back and spread through the garden, a sound not of celebration but of profound respect. Madison trembled as Henry turned, ready to lead her the final few feet to the altar. As they took their first step together, she leaned in, her voice a choked whisper that only he could hear. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you for forgiving me." Henry looked straight ahead, his gaze fixed on the future, on the promise he was finally fully keeping. "Your father," he replied, his voice soft and steady, "believed in forgiveness. He taught me that some of the deepest wounds can only be healed by grace." And with that, the decorated war hero, the man she had called a janitor, walked the bride down the aisle. After the ceremony, which was concluded with a newfound sense of humility and grace, the reception took on a completely different tone. The arrogance and pretension had evaporated, replaced by a quiet, reflective atmosphere. During the toasts, Henry was called to the stage. He didn't speak for long. He spoke of his friendship with Richard Crane, of the courage and integrity of the man he knew. And then he turned his attention to someone else. "There was another person here who showed true character," he said, his voice ringing with sincerity. "A young woman who saw a man, not a uniform, who offered kindness when she saw cruelty." He looked out into the crowd and his eyes found Emma Carter, who was standing near the back, trying to remain invisible. "Emma," he called out, "please come up here." Emma, her face flushing, was nudged forward by her fellow staff members. She walked to the stage, her legs feeling like jelly. Henry smiled at her, a warm, genuine smile. "Because of your integrity," he announced to the crowd, "the Veterans Family Fund is proud to offer you a full 4-year scholarship to the university of your choice." Emma gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as tears of joy filled her eyes. The room erupted in heartfelt applause. Later in the evening, a transformed Madison took the stage. Her voice was quiet, stripped of its earlier arrogance. She announced that she and Elliot were pledging an additional $1 million to the fund, and that she would be personally volunteering to lead a new initiative in her father's name, dedicated to helping the families of fallen soldiers. It was the beginning of her long road to redemption. And Elliot? He was left in the background, a silent, embarrassed figure at his own wedding. His wealth and status had been exposed as hollow, his character found wanting. He was a footnote in a story that was no longer about him. As the guests departed that evening, they were different people than the ones who had arrived. They left not talking about the flowers or the food, but about honor, about humility, and about the quiet janitor who had reminded them all of what truly mattered. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lawn where the wedding had taken place. The lights of the country club glowed warmly against the deepening twilight. The story of Madison Crane and General Henry Lewis was already becoming a legend, a cautionary tale that would be whispered in these privileged halls for years to come. But the real lesson was simpler, quieter. Never measure a person by the clothes they wear, the car they drive, or the job they do. Those are just the covers of the book. Measure them by the life they've lived, the kindness they've shown, the integrity they've maintained in the face of hardship. Some uniforms, whether a janitor's gray jacket or a general's dress blues, carry stories of sacrifice and honor that built the very freedom we enjoy. Henry Lewis did not stay for the end of the party. He had no desire for the fawning attention that was now being directed his way. His job was done. His promise to his old friend, Richard Crane, had been kept. He slipped out through a side door just as quietly as he had arrived. He walked across the vast, empty parking lot, a solitary figure in the fading light, his posture straight, his purpose fulfilled. The world felt a little kinder, a little more just, as the screen fades to black. If this story about dignity and justice moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know below.